Hello there. I've just written a piece for Thinking Travel about the complex kind of outlook that is developing for the Australian tourism industry. I'm thinking specifically about the impact of the outbreak in New South Wales, which today has peaked again and looks increasingly out of control. The emerging problem in Victoria, and the fact that these two, our biggest states, are facing a kind of dislocation from the other four states, which have zero COVID or close to it, and what that might mean for the future. So the Premier of New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian, has basically proposed that zero COVID is no longer a realistic proposition. And that is looking increasingly like a realistic observation when it comes to New South Wales. But the states that have zero COVID still are pretty unlikely to be persuaded that that is a reality that they have to accept right now in any case, because those states have enjoyed the best time of the entire pandemic. Western Australia has had a booming economy, a booming travel industry throughout, and I'm sure there are some, I'm sure it's patchy, I'm sure some businesses that are more exposed internationally are struggling, but generally the industry is in pretty good shape. And some businesses, some tourism businesses in Western Australia are having a record-breaking time. Here in New South Wales and in Victoria, things are much less rosy. So it's not likely that a state like Western Australia is going to be taking advice from New South Wales or Victoria on how they should handle the opening of their economy. Of course, what remains unknown is whether those states can continue to be zero COVID. But the evidence, the data is in. Zero COVID, if you can make it happen and make it and sustain it, is the best thing for the tourism industry, the best thing for the general economy, and of course, most importantly, the thing that will give you the least deaths and serious illness. So it wins the argument, and Western Australia is looking more vindicated than ever. I keep referring to them because Mark McGowan, the Premier of Western Australia, is probably the most vigorous in his advocacy for the approach he's taken, and the data tells the story, and it is not likely that he'll be taking advice from Gladys Berejiklian unless he finds himself in a similar position. So that means those four states may well be closed to people from New South Wales and possibly Victoria for quite a while. And it's hard to know when that will change, because the federal government's guidance, the Doherty report, talks about targets of 70–80% vaccination. But those targets are always premised on the idea that there will be only very, very small outbreaks across the country. Well, New South Wales outbreak is now not looking very small. It's still small by global standards, but by our own standards, and I think by the Doherty standards, it's high. So all those assumptions are kind of going to have to be revisited. So it seems possible that we may have a strange scenario where New South Wales and possibly Victoria are isolated from the rest of Australia. And there's something even more strange to consider, and that is the possibility that if the world has a higher tolerance of COVID than Australia does, that a COVID-impacted state like New South Wales might, when vaccination rates pick up, be able to open up tentatively in a fashion that zero COVID states won't be able to. But there's one very big caveat on that, and that is that even high vaccination rates are proving to not provide the kind of cover that we had hoped. So places like Israel, parts of North America and the UK are still experiencing pretty nasty outbreaks despite having high vaccination rates. Now, those outbreaks are far less lethal, so they're killing far fewer people, they're making far fewer people sick. So they're still, you know, the vaccination, the argument in favour of vaccination is still overwhelming. But a state that's saying, well, why don't we wait a little longer? There might be better vaccines in the pipeline that will be more effective against Delta. And there also might be better treatments in the pipeline, as there are already better treatments that reduce the lethality of COVID. So if you can, it would seem very likely that the economic and obviously the human implications of staying zero COVID for as long as you can are overwhelmingly in your favour. But what that means for our industry going forward is really kind of, well, it means that we don't have the kind of optimism that I think many of us had just a few months ago. So New South Wales has changed the game for the whole country, and it really leaves a very uncertain outlook for the coming sort of 6 months. And it's hard to believe that we're about to enter the third year of facing this COVID thing down. So wherever you are, I hope you're doing okay. I guess my outlook, apart from, you know, obviously I'm very concerned about the state of the industry here in Australia, but I'm also very aware that in our region, in Southeast Asia, the situation is infinitely more troubling. And I'm particularly aware of the situation in Vietnam. Vietnam has an outbreak that has caused a massive loss of life. Like Australia, Vietnam had done very well in 2020, both in terms of COVID outbreaks and in terms of its economic performance. But it is facing an outbreak of an absolutely different order. Unlike Australia, Vietnamese people don't have access to vaccines as we do, which is just heartbreaking. And the country is facing a lockdown of a more severe lockdown. Vietnam's been in lockdown since before the New South Wales lockdown began, or Saigon has, I beg your pardon, and Saigon is facing an escalation in its lockdown that will mean that from next week, food will be delivered by the military and supermarkets will also close. So and knowing that the country just doesn't have the ability to get access to vaccinations, it's just a heartbreaking situation. So this crisis is very difficult, and we're seeing in Europe and North America some glimmers of hope, but even they are tinged with some concern. But in our region, things are really tough. And here in Australia, things are very tough for the industry as well. So wherever you are, be well, and we will talk again very soon. Thanks for checking out Thinking Travel.